About emotions in cycling. Now, Andy disappeared about 2 minutes before the presentation, and I'm thinking, where is he? And I was feeling sheer fear because he had disappeared. So I'm shaking, and it's impacting on my performance. So I'm feeling a wee bit more nervous than I would have otherwise. But we can just see from that wee example that emotion has got a key impact on how we act as coaches or how athletes perform when they're racing. So, with no further ado, I'll introduce Professor Andy Lane.
Thank you. Okay, let's start. Okay, we're looking at motion regulation in cycling. It's, I don't know how I follow Asker's fantastic presentation, but we'll see how we get on. It's a terrific topic, emotions in cycling, and something we can all relate to, and you obviously much more than that. Cycling books by cyclists are fantastic to read from an academic's point of view because they're actually rich of data and interesting stories of cyclists managing intense, unpleasant emotional states and psychophysical states. And we get one from Lance Armstrong. Just talking through how he has conditioned himself over time to accept what would be for a recreational cyclist a considerable degree of discomfort. For a recreational cyclist will most likely stop exercising, but it's seen it as normal. There are processes that have gone by for someone at the elite end to be able to tolerate fairly intense amounts of exercise and see them as normal, and so on. We get what that might mean and what the emotions that might come from not being able to tolerate those sorts of levels, that intense exercise, from Lance Armstrong, saying that the pain you experience is temporary. The emotional response that might be after that, guilt, feeling a sense of being slightly miserable at your own performance, will last far after that. So we get that. We get those processes. Mark Cavendish is a terrific example of emotion regulation and emotions, and his book is full of them. And here's a simple quote which illustrates how he has reappraised, which is a term psychologists use to say that you've changed how you thought about a situation, which can influence the emotional impact. How he's reappraised how he approaches hills, and it's a very nice comment about he rides them to survive, others ride them to win, but he reconciled that he's a survivor by when he has his good day on the flat. I am very much in the category of the Lance Armstrong quote, and quite a lot of my bike riding is influenced by my repeated falling off and being run over by cars, which does help with your motivation to get on again in the future. But you can't be worried about it, and you can't be worried about it if you want to go quickly. So we are part of a broad program of research, the work I'm doing, the work I'm going to be presenting, called EROS, nice title, EROS, Emotion Regulation of Others and Self, and it's a collaborative research with Oxford and Sheffield and Manchester, and brings the study of emotion from a series of different perspectives. And that, from a sports psychology perspective, is absolutely fantastic because you draw on knowledge from social psychologists, clinical psychologists, which may not be in the sports literature, which may not have permeated to the wider literature for which sport athletes and coaches may be available. So it's been a really enriching experience for me, and maybe we'll be looking at some of those theories as we go through. So the aims of my talk are to look at these questions. Do emotions influence cycling performance? And for anyone who's done anything which has evoked intense emotions, which is everyone, it's hard to see how there's not an emotional effect to what you're going to do. Specifically in cycling, we'll look at the relationship between emotions and physiological variables. The delivery of performance in cycling largely depends on the ability, as we heard from Asker just now, on the ability to maintain energy systems to the working muscles and perform at a rate which is possibly desirable for you and at a rate which is beyond your. So people try to achieve goals which they physically may not be able to attain on the day, but go for them anyway. And then we'll look at the strategies which people use to manage their emotions, and we'll look at possible ones available. And it's quite nice we're in a nice position from that, in that we have just launched a study with BBC Lab UK. It's fronted by Michael Johnson. I'll come to it at the end. But it involves people participating in an online test, of which there are 12 different intervention strategies, of which on completion on those you get access to the videos from the other interventions. But we'll talk about that later. But it is quite a nice, it's an opportune moment that came online earlier this month, which allowed me to change what I was going to talk about to include all that stuff, which I think is really exciting. And if you've had a go on it, hopefully you think so too. I'm going to conclude by saying, and I'll tell you, I wasn't doing this so I can just finish and go home. It's just to sort of set the scene for what's about to come. Emotions might catalyse processes that provide extra energy for movement. Big terms. But I think what is absolutely correct is that unwanted emotions during performance can use energy in ways that you don't want them to do. So feeling anxious on a difficult hill when your legs are already in agony, the effect of anxiety can amplify those sensations of fatigue. You start thinking, I'm anxious, maybe I'm not going to get up to this speed, maybe I'm not going to keep up with the rider ahead of me, maybe I haven't taken enough energy on, and all those anxieties can fuel sometimes unhelpful thoughts. Sometimes they might fuel strategies so that you'll say, okay, I can't get up this hill now, so I'll try to go a bit harder as a consequence. Then maybe later on down the ride you may not, you may feel the effects of those. We're going to look at people. We're going to look at how people can get better at regulating their emotions, and some of those strategies someone has just talked about. So, what are emotions? That is the beauty of studying something and looking at something that everybody experiences, everyone can relate to, and what do emotions tell us about ourselves, and why are they relevant to anything to do with sport? Well, what does anger? When someone gets angry, why are they? It gets angry? Well, anger has a real function for us. Anger says someone has upset us, someone has frustrated us. Anger is associated with a huge action tendency. When you're angry, we're pretty good at doing things at the cause of that anger. They may not be appropriate, but without too much dispute, anger can be a very energising emotion. And when someone is angry and feeling full righteousness at arguing with the person who's made them angry, they feel brilliant about themselves, and later on they often feel guilty at the inappropriate said things that they've said. But anger is a powerful emotion. Worry. We all get worried. Typically get worried when things are very important and the task we're about to do is uncertain. Well, that describes most people's experiences of sport. Sport is inherently uncertain. There are no, in any event, you might have a favourite who's most likely to win, but so many things can go wrong. So many things can go wrong. Unexpected things that you weren't, that you hadn't planned for can interrupt your performance to create worry during performance, before performance. If you anticipate those in the future, then they can be quite damaging. There's a whole range of emotions. Some of these, say feeling guilty, we all think, can also be quite motivating, in that someone, if they feel guilty that they haven't performed to their capability, then they'll say, next time I will avoid that emotional that I will seek to avoid experiencing that emotional state. So sometimes as coaches, it's potentially risky to inform someone of the consequences of their actions, and that if you don't do this, you'll lose. The Lance Armstrong quote we saw earlier. But Lance Armstrong had an anticipation of feeling guilt, which energised him to avoid that emotion to begin with. So these emotions have influence how we think, influence how we feel, and influence what we do, and that is fairly important. When we start breaking those down into descriptions to try to make sense of them, I like to do it in this way, where you've got on one axis you've got activation, and activation comes in with a pleasant category of surprise, excited, energetic, and it comes with an unpleasant one, feeling angry, fearful and anxious. We've got low activity in terms of unpleasant, disgust, downhearted and sadness, and low activity in terms of happiness, calm and relaxed. And if we explored more emotional states, we find that people will fill this in with a whole number of different terms. It's important to see that that there is no one perfect emotional state that you're trying to get into. There's no one perfect emotional state that would apply to everyone. Some people perform very well when they're in the high activation part of that group, figure, and that might well be in the unpleasant side. There's lots and lots of evidence to say that athletes perform quite well when they're feeling quite anxious. There's lots of evidence to say athletes perform very well when they're feeling very high activation, pleasant emotions. There's evidence to say that athletes perform very poorly when feeling very happy. And you think, oh, if you feel happy, we should perform quite well. But if you're about to do something without the uncertainty that things could go wrong, you might be happy that you've done everything right, but underestimated the demands of the task. So in that scenario, a little bit of anxiety would be quite useful, because anxiety says, oh, there's warning signals. We need warning signals in our environment. Things may not go to plan. A little bit of anxiety might be quite useful in that respect. Too much calmness, too much relaxation might be associated with some sort of underestimation. The key is to find your own emotional state that links with performance and understand what that emotional state is saying for yourself. And that does vary from person to person. We're going to look at 3 studies in this. They sort of break down into 2. I've just put this on there. They will link in. I think you probably get these slides. If not, links to these are via the BBC project we get to at the end. And it's just a bit of academic showing off, really, this is. But it just says that the studies are published somewhere, been through scrutiny from various different people, and not just something I came off the top of my head earlier. So we started our emotion regulation of others and self project, and we wanted to look at a theory which is in psychology, in general psychology, which says that self-control uses resources. So if you're regulating your emotions, it's using resources. And that's pretty important when you think that if we're trying to get ourselves in the best mindset for performance, we have to do something to try and get ourselves in that state. That might well be using resources. It might well be using the same resources, is what the theory is saying. It's saying that self-control uses glucose. So, well, we don't want to be using our self-control. We just heard that. We don't want to be using our self-control from ASCA. We don't hear using our self-control and trying to get us in the right mindset. We want to be using our self-control and powering the thing along as fast as possible. So, in other words, it starts suggesting that maybe there's a sort of a backfire to trying to regulate your emotions if it's diving into the same resources as those needed for performance. So we had some data. This is already data, and it's collected by Greg White, Matt Wilson and Rob Shea from a few years back. Some of it unused, so I piled it all in together to have another look at. We have a number of cyclists, and they're all doing a standard cycling test at threshold level, so it's quite hard, and they're cycling for quite a long period of time, and we'll see that. We ask them periodically how they're feeling on a standard self-report scale. Not the difficult part of emotions in some respects is to say, have we got a valid measure that will be beyond the frailties of self-report? But this is it's difficult to get one of those, because most of the physiological measures which come with emotions come with several emotions. So we asked them how anxious, angry, depressed they're feeling, and for this analysis we call those the unpleasant emotions. We asked them how tired they are and how vigorous they're feeling. And what we're expecting over a period of time is that people feel quite vigorous at the start, not fatigued at the start, and as they progress through cycling, they might stay feeling quite vigorous because they're sufficiently practiced in keeping themselves feeling fairly energised, but that there'll be progressive increase in fatigue. What we did was when we looked at the data, and this was where it became quite interesting, is I looked at the data in terms of which riders reported any symptoms during that period of an unpleasant emotion. If a rider reported that they felt a bit angry, a bit downhearted, a bit depressed, a bit tense, a bit anxious, then their data were looked at as calling them unpleasant emotions. And this is the results we found. And the interesting story to that is that the unpleasant emotion, people who had experienced unpleasant emotions, seem to have to increase the amount of physiological load in order to produce the same amount of work as those in a pleasant emotional state. Suggesting there, if those people who are experiencing angry, why are they feeling angry fairly early on in a ride? At a rate which is a self-determined rate of intensity which they know that they can handle because they're reasonably good cyclists, starting to feel depressed and so on. Possibly these emotions are unwanted, and therefore they will imply that there will be some degree of emotion regulation activities going on in the mindset of the rider. So in other words, potentially that they are using more resources, and the more resources this time shows itself through their breathing harder, which might be that the internalisation of how they're riding feels harder, and increasing your breathing on the belief that it gets more air in, gets more oxygen in, gets more carbon dioxide out, and so on and so forth, will make them feel a bit easier. We get then the pleasant emotional group having a little kick up near the end where their ventilation increases, possibly in anticipation of the ride ending. Our conclusions to that was quite an interesting insight to what comes next, that those riders who maintain a pleasant emotional state seem to be in a better position to be able to put some effort into the ride nearer the end. And that has got lots of bearings on race performance, in that if you're not regulating unwanted emotions early in the event, then you might be saving something later for the final part. And remember, they're going at an intensity which is related to their maximum. All those vary from rider to rider. So we followed that up with a second study, of which we had 7 well-trained cyclists. One of them is sitting over there in the corner. I haven't brought him in just so that if I need a backup, I've got one of the participants here. Just happens to be interested in the area. And what we did with these is we brought them into the lab to do 10-mile time trials on the ergo. And cyclists are fantastic at doing these sorts of things because they take the performance so seriously. Now, I used to work with cyclists in a sort of development squad in London, and I used to see the psychologist and the physiologist and the nutritionist, and it sort of rolled around like that. And if I had a cyclist who'd come from a test, from one of the fitness tests, from the bike test, who hadn't got the right Watt score, I have to spend the next hour trying to pick him up and he's going, oh, but I only got a score of this. And so it was quite nice as a group, from a scientist perspective, you've got these people who take these things so seriously. It's really good. So we put them through 4 tests. Firstly, they had full feedback where they sat on the ergo. There's the machine. They can see their heart rate going up. There's the lactate scores. They've got a little glance of that. There's a screen in front of them that which we asked them to rate their emotions during, and they could see the results going back from that. In other words, they got the full Monty, their power output, and so on and so forth, how far they're going along. And they whizzed through the first time as fast as possible. And then we had 3 different conditions. One was to have absolutely no feedback whatsoever, so we blanked everything out and just told them to start riding and then stop when they got to 10 miles. The other 2 was a positive feedback. So what we would do after every mile is we would in the positive feedback and the negative feedback, we have blanked out all the equipment still, but we are giving the feedback verbally to them as they're going. So after 1 mile, we tell them how fast they've gone, the miles per hour, that type of thing. In the positive feedback, we manipulate this by telling them they've gone faster than what they are. And from a researcher, this is quite, the pilot to this was ride the test yourself. So each of the study group rode the test. I did it, and we tried to see if being deceived in an experiment we knew what was coming, could we predict the condition we were in? And we couldn't. So the 5% manipulation of time, so if you've done 25 miles an hour in the first mile, then 2 minutes 30, we took 5% off that time in seconds, made a record of it, and told the rider accordingly. And the good thing about cyclists is that in telling them that first score, it recognises, bosh, there it goes, yeah, I'm behind what I should be. And so that was quite useful. And for the negative, we told them they're going 5 minutes slower. So we've got a record of that, so that the next mile we could then doctor the times accordingly, each going 5% slower. We piloted that, so it was meaningful. Very, very hard to see the difference. You don't go much different. You don't go. You don't notice that you're in either group, other than it feels agony, and these things feel agony, don't they? 10 mile cycling on an ergo takes 20 so minutes of absolute agony, and it's one emotional state is hold off the agony for the whole time. We measured a whole load of physiological variables: lactate, oxygen, ventilation rate, heart rate, and we looked blood glucose. That was our initial hypothesis, was to look at the social psychology literature, which would say regulating up your emotions, it uses glucose. And then we assessed our emotional states: calm, happy, energetic, active, gloomy, sluggish, downhearted, angry, anxious. And we asked them how hard it was to control their emotional state as a question. We did this as they're going along. We put the emotion questions in front of them. They shouted their score out accordingly. So what do we find? The graph's slightly misleading in that respect, in that, and this result was somewhat bizarre for all of us, and we looked at this for ages as to what's going on, and we'll see why at the end slide, is that there was no difference in the finish time, and there was no difference between the power output between the two conditions. So in other words, in the positive and negative feedback conditions, they did the same times and the same power outputs. And you think, wow, well, what's going on there? So we then looked at some of the emotions, and this is pretty much what we'd expect, in that the effect of the negative feedback had a pretty damaging effect as the first mile kicks in, big drop in happiness, and then big drop as we're going along throughout the course. Feeling energetic, negative feedback, weaving around its difference with the positive feedback, but dropping nearer the end. We've told them they're going so badly in the end, they start believing it, and so on. The lack of energy at the end. Relatively small differences. Remember, the Likert scale 1 to 7. So the differences are quite small, but these are experienced cyclists. We're not going to break their heart by telling them they're going a little bit slower than what we'd expect. We just saw that despite the information we told them, they managed to perform at the same level. In other words, they did experience unpleasant emotions, but regulated their emotions accordingly to push themselves through that. Feeling downhearted, we get a much clearer result coming on from downhearted, that being told you're going slowly, it gradually increases how downhearted you're feeling. And what's the action tendency of feeling downhearted is to close in, it's the feeling you want to stop, it's to preserve resources. Downhearted is often not an emotion that is quite helpful for performance, during performance. If you anticipate feeling downhearted beforehand, you've got a chance to say, oh, actually, I'll tell you what, I don't want to feel like that. I'll start doing something to prevent that in the future. But during, you can get stuck in trying to not being able to get rid of this. Feeling anxious, the shock of being given the negative feedback sends up anxiety fairly early on. It sticks up fairly highly. And then we have some of the physiological variables. There's not much difference in heart rate, and there's not much difference in lactate. And just for the lactate scores for people there we shoot up to scores of we shoot up to scores of 6, 8 and 10 as we get near the end of that, and obviously feeling a lactate score of 10 is just agony. So in other words, we had riders who really did give their all in this, and try to perform as fast as possible, which is quite a useful feature of any study. The confidence to control your emotions, there's the effect on that. The positive feedback had the effect of making you feel more confident you could control your emotions, and in terms of the effort it took, negative feedback seemed very harder to change your emotions. So the picture would be that the negative feedback was perceived as harder than the positive feedback. Even though they produced the same performance, it was associated with feeling miserable, it's associated with difficulty trying to change these emotions. We start noticing some differences in some of the physiological variables, in that they performed to the same physical level, remember. The positive feedback group just worked at a lower oxygen uptake level. In other words, they have headroom to go higher, potentially headroom to go higher, because these are the same people doing each test. For the same level of performance, the oxygen uptake is greater. It just suggests there's headroom in the pleasant emotion condition. Why we don't get to that, we'll look at shortly. Blood glucose concentration, and this is where we got some great difficulty in thinking through the literature from psychology, because we were expecting in some way that if you're regulating your emotions, then glucose goes down. But what we find, probably our naivety of psychologists in some ways, maybe, in that the blood glucose it shoots up as we progress through this test. And it's quite an interesting finding, but the available glucose in the positive condition is much greater. Now that could be, of course, is that glucose, as theorised by social psychologists, that the brain uses glucose. The brain, big organ, in regulating, is proposed to use blood glucose, and therefore that difference could be explained through brain activity potentially. But it suggests that within the positive group there's a greater amount of glucose available, and that would suggest there's potential benefits there. So we then started to go, why was there no behavioural differences why was there no performance differences? Why were the mean scores for the two conditions almost identical? Because it just didn't make sense. So we got the power output from the machine and started looking at what went on a stroke by stroke basis. And what we get in the negative feedback and unpleasant emotion would be what looks like someone doing an interval session, in that there's rapid bursts of activity, big spike up, followed by a bigger spike coming down. In other words, you sprint for a bit, you come down for a bit. Sprint for a bit, you come down for a bit. Starts to make sense when if you're told you're going behind, on a bike you haven't got too many strategies available. You can change what you think, and that would be one. You could minimise the effect of going slower on what it means to your self-worth, which might be, I did a hard ride yesterday, probably not going to go as well today, and you start changing your perspective on the performance. But if you're not prepared to do that, and labs can lend themselves to a performance climate where you can't just have a day off, because your ride is being evaluated by people very closely. You feel very much on the spot. Their behavioural strategy is to simply push harder to a point it starts feeling agony. In other words, you sprint for a bit, can't keep that going, you have to slow down. So it's like sustaining 20 miles an hour on average by going very fast for 1 mile, very slow for the other. If you do intervals and average that, it'll feel much harder than pottering along somewhere down the middle. So in our positive feedback and pleasant emotion condition, the story is that they maintained a far more consistent pacing strategy. because the belief that they are getting towards their goal is being reinforced from the experimenters who are telling them about their feedback. But there's clear implications for the information that's coming back to a rider when riding. If they're behind what they want to do, they're going to take the strategy will be to try and push more effort in the short term, which may not be sustainable for a long period of time. The brief spikes are probably us mucking about with a rider. So when someone comes to take lactate, they're going to grab their ear, pull some blood out. It was painful, but he sort of enjoyed that bit, I think. So you get a little dip, and then the person picks it up. So you're always going to get some spikes. You're not going to get a perfect one. Very much so. These were the results that echoed why people were not, how the performance maintained itself, and the likely strategy is that when someone is falling back, how they may try to regulate their emotions thereafter. So that's what I just said. So we get to interventions, and quite nicely. I picked this one up off very simple emotion regulation. It wasn't said it's emotion regulation, but it was on Yahoo. It just happens that it was by Kenny Dalglish, the former Liverpool manager. Said everyone needs picking up. The best way to pick yourself up is to put in a winning performance. Of course, he got sacked this week, didn't he? So it's true. It's true, and it's obviously not. It's not easy for him now to do that with his own evaluation of himself because he's being sacked. But that makes sense. For people who are serious about their sport, that is the strategy people need to do to change their emotional state. And we saw that in the riders, that as they got put back, as they believed that they were underperforming, then they move forwards, they approach that by trying to push themselves a lot harder as a consequence. Now, what we've done is we're going to go through two intervention studies that we've done. This one, very briefly, one is with and the second one we'll get to the BBC when I talk through that because I find that really exciting. We did a study with runners, and we did it in conjunction with the running magazine Runner's World. And what that was Runner's World agreed to put an advert, if you like, on their newsletter which said, take part in a study to improve your performance. And so they completed information which said how they felt during their best performance, how they felt in their worst performance, and then we asked them to set a goal for the study that they're about to do, and that's self-determined. So pick an event you want to run well in. Might be a 5k, might be a marathon, might be 10k, and so on. And give yourself a goal for that. And we gave them flexibility in the goal that they could achieve. It could be to come in a position. It could be to achieve a certain time. Complete flexibility. And we were interested in the extent to which they achieved their goal rather than what their goal was. And we allowed that to be self-determined. We assessed their emotional state before and a whole variety of measures during. Over a 1 week period. I suppose someone could have done that study here. I should have found out beforehand. But maybe you might. Yeah, well, if you have, you can say at the end whether what I said matched with what is coming here. It's what we intended. And then there was a series of different interventions, and the interventions were designed to try and get people to regulate emotional states experienced during performance and try to get themselves better at regulating those emotional states. We gave them 5 different strategies. One was something called if-then planning, which I'm going to talk about in the BBC project in the context of that. But I mean, if-then planning is a fabulous strategy that's come from social psychology. Absolutely fabulous, because it is so simple. But it's something very similar to what people do normally. It simply says, you work out what the ifs are, which are problems, barriers to performance, something that could go wrong, something that you don't want to happen. So if if I forget my words during this presentation, for example, or if I'm riding along and I notice I'm coasting, if my legs feel tired, a whole series of ifs that runners or any endurance athlete or any athlete might have a problem to, and they can be personal. You put a then solution. When you feel or think this, what would you want to do in an ideal situation? And it might well be that if I feel slightly tired, then I will concentrate on my technique and tell myself to relax, and that'll go quicker. Would be one for one person. If I feel that if I'm daydreaming, then I'll focus on, I'll concentrate on the race and perform much quicker. A whole variety of things. Now the trick to this is the if-then component, because if you say, oh, what's my if-then plan, as soon as you trigger the if part, you start remembering the then part. How this is proposed to work is supposed to automise identification of the problem with the solution. So it can be done for anything and for any situation. We picked it for unwanted emotional states experienced during running, or can be cycling, can be any sport. So if you felt like this beforehand, then you put a solution to it. Those thens are, as coaches, as athletes, are opportunities to think, what would I like to be thinking? What's the bit I want to be thinking? Do I need to remind myself of a good training session if I've had doubts that I can reproduce my best form? Quite often, the reason anxiety and unwanted emotions spiral is that when the emotion initiates itself, the solution to rethinking that through is sometimes a set of random thoughts which don't really quite helpful. It might be if I feel anxious, then I say to myself, yeah, I'm anxious, that's part of the deal because this is an important event and I should feel a bit anxious. Simply to put the thing into context, to reappraise it so that it's understood by the individual rather than letting it run away. Goal setting was exactly the same information, but in a different format. So it wasn't presented as if-then. It's presented as I want to do this, but without the if-then component. And interestingly, there's lots of studies which put these two solutions together against each other, and the if-then performs in a superior way than the goal setting because it tries to autonomise. Psychological skills is our control condition, in that we asked people their psychological skills to begin with, and what we found was that, in other words, do you usually set goals before you're running? Do you do imagery? And if they said yes to that, then we asked them again, why don't you continue doing that, in essence? So it's a control condition which didn't compromise our initial invite for people to try and get better into the study. But they are doing, we're not told them anything they haven't done already, they just told them to do more of the same what they were doing. And then two music conditions, I'm not going to talk about those, but they, in essence, to listen to music before and during as a motivational strategy. What we found that all seemed to work, which was useful, but it did say, when we then dug a bit further, is that those people who had positive beliefs that thought that my emotions get in the way of my performance, invested more effort, if you like, or invested a greater degree of planning into the study and got greater benefits. So if you went into the study and said, well, it's not going to work for me, this isn't, lo and behold, it had lower effects on you than if you went into the study with the idea that having a strong link with emotions and performance, you got better at regulating your emotions. A caveat to that is that if you didn't think you were very good at regulating your emotions, that also appeared to impact on the results. So if you were low in confidence about regulating, about being able to control emotions, you tended not to get so much benefits out of it. Only a short 2-week study, but what that did is it put forward the retesting of why if-then planning, goal setting and psychological skills could be useful. But then we dug into that in a bit more. So we get this fantastic opportunity working with BBC Lab UK, and whereas the previous study links to a website and a web link, what this one does it's front-led by somebody really quite famous. And it's got Michael Johnson at the start, who comes on and says, performing the best you can is about controlling unwanted emotions, in essence. About performing under pressure is very difficult. And it then takes you through a series of tests. The credibility, of course, of this increases because of the person who's delivering it. And if you remember previously we talked about beliefs going into interventions. If you believe the person is going to be helpful to you, then it's quite possible that it's that belief that you've got this great person that's going to talk you through this intervention that might be quite useful. So the credibility of the persuader is really important. And we think that helps with something like this. And I think 60,000 people have done it so far, so that's pretty good going. And we haven't got the results yet, but I'll talk you through what's going on. Anyone can do it, bbc.co.uk/compete, there's the advertising, but that's why I'm pleased to do this now, because you go to these sorts of talks and, well, what do we need to get from this? Well, you simply take part in this study, takes 20 minutes, and you get access to the interventions that come at the end. So we did a simple performance task in this, which is computer-based, but you've got the intervention of if-then planning explained of how if-then planning works. If the problem comes, then the solution comes. And from the explanation, you can say, well, how do I tailor that to any event that I've got? If you're riding in a time trial, you can start thinking through, well, if this happens, time trialing is if you get caught in the first 5 minutes, how are you going to come back from that? Fairly demoralising if you do get caught. But the if-then plan would create a scenario that makes it quite possible to have a solution which might stop you losing more time than you would do, because being passed early on could have the effect of game over today. Self-talk, similar to the goal-setting stuff, it's very what we have in this is a sort of technical type of self-talk, so talking you through the mechanics of how you can improve performance. So self-talk technical might be in cycling to relax your arms on the handlebars. It might be self-talk regarding a degree of technique. I was doing some of the cycling, and a great sort of technique I've used with cyclists is to do some imagery so that the rider sees their feet as an old-fashioned steam train, where you just see this unstoppable force of your feet and the pedals going round and round, and get that image in your head. And that the nice part about that sort of imagery is the circular nature of the imagery that you're doing, and if you can get your mind attuned to the spinning of the train going round, the train, your image is taking your feet round. So some sort of self-talk which works around that type of activity, and a visualisation similar to what I was talking about, but in terms of getting an image of yourself performing, seeing that image. And the nice part about imagery is a terrific way of practicing without the physical exertion, but what comes with visualising and imagery is a sense of some of those emotions, some of those sensations that come with performing in real life. So if you know you've got a very important race that's coming on, sitting down going, I've got this really important race that's coming on. If you can imagine yourself at the start line, or half an hour from performance, around that environment, it's likely that there's going to be an emotional flooding. If you capture that imagery right, you'll start feeling a bit nervous. And then you are then experiencing, albeit in a lower intensity, a similar emotional experience as to those you'd be experiencing on the day. What does that do? It gives you practice to doing it. It gives you the opportunity to see yourself performing, feel that performance, and be able to replay in your mind, performing quite well, replay in your mind the sort of invasion of unwanted thoughts and how you might get rid of those with an if-then plan. If an if-then plan was set up for that. which recreates that scenario of feeling quite good at the time when it matters. And if you can do that in your mind, if you do it in your mind, you stand a chance of being able to replay that in the day. And you're in control of that. You're starting going to have this sort of level of preparation. That's pretty important. A key part to this study and to the other study is the idea that psychological skills psychological skills training can lead to some benefits fairly early on. And the difficult, from a psychologist's point of view, is that you can get people, as I talked about, those people who were not so keen on who didn't make as much progress on the running study, is that if someone comes in and says, well, yeah, but you're not going to change my psychological state by what you it's quite difficult to change that belief unless they gain some evidence to say that it works. So a short intervention where they have a go at something and get a positive result can make the step to trying to get something that would work. And that applies to almost any sort of coaching in situation where you tell someone to do something. If they think it's any good, they're more likely to do it in the future. If your intervention with an athlete takes 6 months before there's any effect, then your athlete's going to struggle to keep motivated for that, given that so much of their life successes vary on performance, not in 6 months' time necessarily, but the performance in 6 weeks' time or 6 days' time, or quite typically in a sports psychologist's life. Can you see athlete X on Thursday? They've got a race on Saturday, and we want them right. And I'll tell you what, the interesting part to that is when I speak to psychologists in the other areas, the clinical psychologists simply will take such a long-term view on any issue that someone's got, and that regarding of way of thinking, and to make permanent changes in how someone thinks takes so long. And it's not that sports people are any different in the client-athlete relationship. It's that the beliefs in the sporting environment expect success to be immediate, and the challenge for the psychologist is almost impossible. And from my point of view, possibly from any person's view who's trying to work with someone to get better, the expectation placed on you in sport is so much higher than some other areas for the immediate success. And then sometimes, if there's a psychological pattern that underpins that, and you've got to change how you think about things. Well, if you've had that patterning 1,000 times before, then it's going to take more than one go to stop you when you get into that state to start thinking, into this way of thinking, to start changing that. But this process has to start from somewhere, and this is how we're getting on. So this is what this study comes on. It kicks through. Michael introduced what you're going to do, and you get fabulous feedback from this. And I just put this slide on there because Ian sitting over there hasn't got a score of 45 seconds on his test yet. Although I did hear that he played it 14 times to get close. He's got 41, but I've got the evidence to show my 45 here, which I'm fortunate that, because the tests do vary, as you can see. The test maker doesn't always do very well. What this then does, it then gives information about your best and worst performance, which you described earlier on in the test, which described to someone, delivered by Michael Johnson, what emotional state is associated with best performance for you, and then describes what you could do to try and get yourself into that best emotional state in the future. So quite nicely what this does for everybody who takes part in it, they get personalised feedback based on the data that they've put in to begin with, which describes something useful, which relates to them and only to them. And all these emotions, so you can't break the test to come into something that doesn't work, no matter how hard you try, because it's fairly bomb-proof. BBC boys did that and did a terrific job on it. Whatever emotional state you've got in there, it will then talk you through something to get that better. It then talks through styles of regulating your emotion. One of those is called suppression. Is that when you feel very anxious or very excited and you want to change that, you might try and squash those feelings. And the difficulty in trying to suppress anxious, so you're feeling anxious, I'm not feeling anxious now. and you don't feel anxious for a second, the next second you think about anxious, it goes back into the room. If I said, don't think of a white bear, then some people have, oh my God, there it comes in again, great bear comes into my mind again. The idea that you don't want to do something, that's why the not stop smoking works so badly. Don't smoke. So I'm not going to smoke today. I'm not going to smoke today. I'm going to go on a diet. I'm not going to eat a cake. I'm not going to eat a cake. There's a cake over there. I'll tell you what, I haven't had a cake for 8 years. I haven't had a cake for it. And you prime your thinking to experience these things and start searching them out. Suppression often involves a rebound to experience that emotion, whereas reappraisal is to change what you're thinking about the situation. So you start saying, well, it's dinner. There's a cake over there. I'll tell you what I'll do. I won't have the cake today. I'll tell myself I've been a good boy and I'll have a cake later. That would be reappraising the urge to have a cake. It might be in cycling, you're out for a group ride and someone fires off the front. You've followed your training program that today is a long, slow fat-burning session as suggested earlier. I said, well, I'll tell you what, my strategy today was to keep it at a certain intensity and I'm not going to follow that lunatic on the front. And that sounds much easier. That sounds dead easy to do in this room, but if there's a group of cyclists and out now and off went on the front, it would be far harder for anyone to go, I'm reappraising that now. Tends not to happen, and we tend to be... reappraising would be simply to change what you think about that situation, to think through it differently, to change the emotional response that comes with it. And that's partly why the if-then can work so well, and that you can set up when the situations would come. There would be a classic if-then for reappraising of the situation. If so-and-so rides off the front, like he does every week, and it was meant to be an intended slow ride, and they all end up as a flat race at the end. Whilst those things can be quite fun to do, they can be awfully detrimental for a long-term planning and training. Because instead of having a slow, easy ride one day and a fast ride the next day, every ride comes into in the same training intensity of hard, and performance moves are not as good as you'd like them to be. So that explains that quite nicely. I'm a salesman to this project, but it gives you a resource to go back and relook at those things, and gives it to your own data. Get your riders to look at it. They get feedback on themselves. If your riders then get their results, they can print those results out. They can bring those results to you, and you can collectively look at them. The stories, the explanations there. It's not asking you to be a psychologist. You're thinking through how people perform within their sport, and how this was applied to cycling is you would be the experts on the then and the ifs, on the goal setting. The riders would be the experts on what emotions they experience and what they don't want to experience, and you can put the two together and you could start working through ways of thinking that the rider might find beneficial at the time when those unwanted emotions are so unhelpful. So, in conclusion to what I've been talking about, went to this part anyway. Interventions can change emotions. We saw that from our runners study. Practice interventions so they can be done automatically. I love the if-then planning as a consequence of that, because the terms linguistically set themselves up to be remembered. There's nothing worse than having a final 600-metre strategy that you forgot. We should have done that when it had gone by, and so on. And you develop habits, if you get into a habit of negative thinking. And you know that if that's the case, then I do lots of running races, and start lines of running races has got so much habitual negativity. It is absolutely, you just have to do it. You finished, and then someone will go, hey, you can do all right. I've had a bit of a hamstring injury, and so on. You just think, well, he didn't need to say he's had a hamstring injury. He just has to say, yes, really, I'll go as well as fast as I can. But you can almost hear the self-handicapping of some people to try and, I'm not going to go as well as I would do today. And I just can't believe 2 days earlier the same self-handicapping was being said by the person, because they were then anticipating going quite well. And sort of as those goals come closer, the nerves kicks in, the unwanted emotions start leading to interpreting your inner physical states, and that you don't feel as ready as you possibly think you should do or ought to do. Partly possibly because you haven't thought how you would be feeling on the in a race of that time. If you understood how you would be feeling, you'd probably be in a better position to say, actually, I feel fine. Overall summary: emotions influence performance. And they influence performance in lots of different ways, and the emotional state the emotions that influence performance are typically very individual. I think emotions can be controlled via guided training, and I'd encourage identifying the emotion that you wish to change and practice strategies to try changing that. And there are lots of them. And see, that's what happens if that's what thank you. And that's what I think. The Eros website has got lots of our stuff. I would encourage the BBC project, and then you will have all the resources and an enjoyable experience for yourself and any of your riders you've got. Thank you very much. How was that for time then?
Perfect.
Okay,
Thanks, Andy. We've got time for a few questions.
What's the BBC website?
bbc.co.uk/compete. It's on the front page of the BBC website on Olympics as well. Yep. Michael Johnson's face.
Any questions? I've got one for you, Andy.
Yeah.
I've got one for you.
I was expecting an exam question from someone. On the physiologists, I thought, because I put some physiology stuff out there, I thought someone's going to come on me with the physiology and expose my lack of knowledge.
That's exactly what I'm going to do, so that's your if-then strategy.
Oh, yeah.
No, in your cycling study, when you were looking at the variable, the more variable power in the negative emotions, within that study, what was the conclusion you came up on? Performance?
There's no difference in performance. No difference whatsoever in performance. The riders who are experiencing unpleasant emotions perform exactly the same as when they felt pleasant emotions. But the difference, I mean, the story there is that why didn't in the pleasant condition the riders take themselves to the same physiological levels as they were in the unpleasant emotional state? Why did they not push themselves higher to those same scores? The assumption would be that they'd go quicker, or that they end up doing the sprinting. They recognise that they can't go beyond the pacing strategy that they were going. A step up from that would be then to have an intervention to work on beliefs regarding that you can have that headroom to go a bit more.
I was thinking more along the lines of, anyone correct me if I'm wrong, but with the variable pacing strategy in a constant environment, then you're going to go slower. So the actual performance is going to be greater, even if it's 5, 10, 15 seconds. That's a worthwhile performance enhancement by working on the negative emotions and trying to get them positive. So, I mean,
the performance effect would be very evident if we took if we had a further line condition, is that you weren't allowed to stop at a certain point. So we could have certain people stopping at different times. And that if we when people went for over an hour, hour and a half, then the people who are going to be, in essence, interval training, are going to have major performance decrements once they've used up however long it took to get to the glucose bottoming, they would get there first.
Right. No, I think Andy's presentation leads on really brilliantly onto the next one with gear, in that gear will be talking about performance planning. And it's maybe something, my perspective as an ex-physiologist is we're always looking at the physical components of performance. But what Andy's talked about today, I think, is training the brain. And it's not a 1, a 2, a 3 day thing that you train within. It's going to lead into what Gear's going to talk about, is planning over full seasons and training the brain over the same sort of duration. So I've taken a lot from Andy, even I was at a presentation before through Bases, and I've implemented so much within my own coaching. So I'd really like to thank Andy for coming along today and sharing